The soft glow of Boston's skyline bled through the panoramic windows of the observatory, a restaurant perched atop the Sterling Tower like a crown jewel. Down below, the city was a river of light and motion, a world away. Up here, the only sounds were the discreet clink of crystal silverware and the hushed murmur of conversations lubricated by $100 glasses of wine. For Julian Croft, the architect of a tech empire built on disruption and digital conquest, it was merely the backdrop for his latest victory. He was a king surveying his kingdom, a man whose net worth fluctuated with the market, but whose power was absolute. But in the next 90 seconds, the illusion of altitude and security would evaporate. The hushed symphony of the elite would be silenced by the discordant shriek of raw violence. Four men, moving with the silent, purposeful grace of wolves, would turn this glass sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. The police were a distant promise, 23 floors below. Croft's personal security, a man he paid more than the mayor, was a ghost. His life, insured for a king's ransom, was about to be auctioned to the lowest bidder. And the only variable, the one unaccounted for piece on a board he thought he controlled, was not a bodyguard or a SWAT team. It was a waitress, a young woman named Elena, a phantom in a black apron, whose mind saw the world not as a series of moments, but as a sequence of moves. A woman who was about to flip the entire game. Elena Petrova moved through the opulent space with a practiced economy of motion that bordered on invisibility. To the patrons, she was a pleasant, efficient cipher who refilled their water, described the Wagyu beef with a vocabulary she'd memorized but couldn't afford, and cleared away the remnants of their indulgence. They saw the crisp uniform and the polite, distant smile. They didn't see the eyes. Her eyes were never still, constantly cataloging, assessing, mapping the room in a fluid, systematic grid. She wasn't just looking, she was reading the board. They didn't notice how she instinctively registered the number of diners versus the number of exits, the placement of the fire extinguishers, the slight wobble in the leg of table 9 that could be used for leverage. They couldn't comprehend that her serene composure was not deference, but a state of intense, coiled awareness. It was a discipline hammered into her from the age of 5 by a man who believed life was a chess match you either won or you lost, with no draws. Her father, a forgotten grandmaster who had fled a crumbling Soviet Union with nothing but his daughter and a deep-seated paranoia, had taught her to see 10 moves ahead, to recognize a gambit before the first piece was sacrificed. For years, the most complex combination she had to calculate was a 4-tops dinner order with 3 separate allergies. Tonight's king was on table 12, the prime corner booth with an uninterrupted view of the harbor. Julian Croft. He wasn't just wealthy, he was a gravitational force, pulling capital, companies, and careers into his orbit, often crushing them in the process. His face, a regular on the cover of Wired and Forbes, was a study in controlled impatience. He had the kind of icy blue eyes that didn't just look at you, but appraised your value and found it wanting. He treated the staff with a frictionless, almost surgical politeness that was more dehumanizing than any overt insult. Across from him, a younger man in an ill-fitting suit, sweat beading on his upper lip, was nervously picking at his bread roll. They were closing the final, brutal chapter of the acquisition of Thorn Automata, a pioneering robotics firm that had been a Boston institution for 50 years. "The board has ratified the final offer, Mr. Croft," the young lawyer stammered. "The liquidation of the remaining assets can begin Monday morning. As for the patent portfolio," Croft held up a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. He took a slow sip of Macallan 25. "The patents are all that ever mattered, Henderson. The rest, the factories, the employees, the legacy, it's scrap metal. Ensure the severance is the legal minimum. We're not a charity." Elena approached the table, her presence a soft ripple in their predatory calm. "Will there be anything else for you this evening, Mr. Croft?" she asked, her voice a modulated alto. He didn't look at her. He simply gestured toward the bill folder. "Just the check, and have my car brought to the private entrance. The Bentley. Tell Peterson I want the engine warm." Peterson was Croft's head of security, a broad-shouldered man currently stationed by the elevator bank, looking as relaxed as a coiled spring. As Elena turned to leave, her gaze swept the room in its customary pattern. It was a subconscious habit, the mental equivalent of a security camera sweep. But this time, the sweep snagged on an anomaly. 4 men had entered the restaurant within the last 15 minutes. Not together, but spaced out, like chess pieces being placed on the board. One was at the bar, nursing a water, his back to the wall, his suit jacket bulging unnaturally over his left shoulder. 2 more were at a small table near the entrance, pretending to read menus, but their eyes were on Croft and the elevator bank. The 4th man was standing near the service corridor, ostensibly waiting for the restroom, but he hadn't moved in 3 minutes. They were all fit, mid-30s, with the kind of hard, watchful stillness that spoke of military or law enforcement training. They wore discreet communications earpieces, the translucent coil barely visible against their skin. Amateurs might think them part of a security detail. Elena knew better. A professional detail works from the outside in, securing perimeters. They don't embed themselves among the populace. This was an infiltration. This was an attack formation. Her heart rate, normally a placid 60 beats per minute, gave a single, hard kick. A Fionn Shadow Bishop, a controlling knight, and 2 rooks cutting off the files. The thought was automatic, her father's voice in her head. She saw their positions, the lines of fire they commanded, the escape routes they were positioned to block. This wasn't chaos. This was a plan. She processed the check for table 12, her movements smooth, betraying none of the glacial ice forming in her veins. She needed to warn someone. But who? The restaurant manager was a flustered man named Gerald who panicked if they ran out of sourdough. Croft's man, Peterson, was one of the targets. She walked back to the table, placing the leather folder down softly. She leaned in slightly, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Croft, your security." He glanced up, annoyed at the interruption. "What about him?" "He is compromised. You are in danger. There are 4 men in this room, and they are here for you. We need to move. Now." Croft stared at her. For a split second, he looked at her not as a waitress, but as a person, and what he saw was an unnerving, absolute certainty. But his world was built on dismissing the concerns of lesser people. He gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Young lady, I have the best security money can buy." Peterson would... He never finished the sentence. The attack was not loud. It was terrifyingly quiet. The man at the bar stood up, pulled a small device from his pocket, and pressed a button. A low-frequency hum filled the room, and every cell phone screen went black. A signal jammer. Simultaneously, the 2 men at the front table rose in unison. They didn't draw guns. They drew something that looked like a TV remote and pointed it at the reinforced glass doors to the private elevator. There was a sharp click, and the magnetic locks disengaged. The 4th man, the one by the service corridor, turned and calmly walked toward Peterson. Peterson, seeing the unfolding situation, finally moved, his hand reaching inside his jacket. But it was too late. The man from the corridor was on him, not with a gun, but with a taser. The crackle of electricity was loud in the sudden silence. Peterson convulsed and dropped, neutralized without a single shot fired. The man from the bar began walking toward Croft's table. He moved with a chilling lack of haste, his eyes locked on the billionaire. He unbuttoned his jacket, revealing a holstered pistol, but he made no move to draw it. He was the picture of confidence. "Julian Croft," the man said, his voice calm and resonant. "My name is Marcus Thorne. My father was Daniel Thorne. Does that name mean anything to you? Or was he just another piece of scrap metal?" The patrons were frozen, a collective gasp hanging in the air. This wasn't a robbery. It was something far more personal. It was a reckoning. In that moment, as Julian Croft's face went white with a dawning, horrified recognition, Elena Petrova knew the game had begun. The opening moves were over, and the invisible waitress, the forgotten pawn, was about to become the most dangerous piece on the board. For the diners in the observatory, the world had devolved into a silent movie of terror. For Elena, the silence was a gift. It cleared her mind, allowing the cold, clear logic of the board to take over. Her father's lessons, drilled into her over thousands of games, flooded her consciousness. Never react to your opponent's threat. Act on your own. Force them to react to you. The enemy had four pieces in play. The leader, Marcus Thorne, was the king, advancing on his target. The man who had tased Peterson was a knight, controlling the exit. The two by the now unlocked elevator were bishops, covering the long diagonals of the room. They had executed a perfect opening, a textbook Queen's Gambit. But every gambit involves a sacrifice, an accepted risk. Theirs was their singular focus on Croft. They had dismissed the rest of the room as pawns, a fatal miscalculation. Elena's first priority was not Croft. It was disrupting their synergy. She needed to introduce a chaotic element they hadn't planned for, to shatter their operational rhythm. Her eyes darted to a nearby waiter's station. On it sat a silver ice bucket, heavy and solid, filled with ice and a bottle of champagne, a blunt instrument. Beside it, a stack of heavy starched linen napkins. Not ideal, but they would have to do. Thorne was 10 feet from Croft's table, savoring his moment. The two bishops by the elevator were watching the room, but their attention was divided. The knight, the man who had taken down Peterson, was his back to her, focused on the main threat, his leader's approach. He was the closest piece. He would be the first to fall. Elena moved, not with haste, but with a fluid, deliberate silence. She scooped up a handful of ice cubes from the bucket and palmed them in her left hand. In her right, she gripped the neck of the champagne bottle. 3 silent steps brought her up behind the knight. She didn't swing the bottle. That was crude, a peasant's move. Instead, she flung the ice cubes hard across the polished marble floor, directly into the path of the two bishops near the elevator. It was a bizarre, almost nonsensical action. The ice skittered across the floor, a sudden, unexpected clatter in the silent room. As she had predicted, the two men flinched, their heads instinctively turning toward the sound for a fraction of a second. A classic diversion. It was all the time she needed. As the knight's head began to turn, curious about the noise, Elena struck. She drove the heavy, indented base of the champagne bottle, the punt, directly into the base of his skull, where the spine meets the cranium. It was a precise, targeted blow, a move designed not to break the bottle, but to transfer every ounce of kinetic energy into a single point. The man's eyes rolled back in his head. He collapsed without a sound, a puppet with its strings cut. One piece removed from the board. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. Thorne spun around, his face a mask of disbelief. The waitress? The girl who had offered him water not 20 minutes ago? He had dismissed her as part of the scenery. Now she stood over his fallen man, the champagne bottle held at the ready like a scepter. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, his hand finally going for his pistol. But Elena was already moving again, her plan unfolding in a rapid cascade. She wasn't pressing the attack. She was repositioning, controlling the terrain. She grabbed Croft's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "My name is Elena," she said, her voice a low, urgent command. "And you are coming with me, now." Croft, shocked into a state of rare obedience, allowed himself to be pulled from the booth. Thorne raised his weapon, but he hesitated. A gunshot would shatter the controlled quiet he had cultivated. It would bring the real police, not just the building security he had likely bypassed. He wanted Croft, not a bloodbath. "Stop them!" Thorne yelled at his 2 remaining men by the elevator. They started forward, but Elena was already using the restaurant's layout to her advantage. She shoved a heavy serving cart into their path, sending a clatter of plates and glasses across the floor, creating another obstacle. She wasn't running for the main entrance. That was a choke point. She was pulling Croft toward the kitchen. "The kitchen is a dead end!" Croft hissed, his composure starting to return in the form of panicked resistance. "Every dead end is an escape route if your opponent thinks it's a dead end," she shot back, the words an echo of her father's coaching. She shoved open the swinging doors and pulled him into the chaotic, stainless steel world of the kitchen. The kitchen staff, chefs, sous chefs, dishwashers, were huddled in a corner, their faces pale with fear. They had heard the commotion and wisely chosen inaction. "Everyone stay down and stay quiet," Elena commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned them into silence. Her eyes were already scanning this new board. A maze of steel counters, open flames, hanging pots and pans. A walk-in freezer. It was cluttered, defensible, and filled with potential weapons. Croft leaned against a counter, breathing heavily, trying to process the impossible reality of the situation. The woman he'd ignored, the functional automaton, had just neutralized a trained professional with a champagne bottle and was now commanding a room like a battlefield general. "What? How did you?" he stammered. Elena ignored him. Her focus was on the small circular window in the swinging door. She could see Thorne and his men regrouping, their initial shock turning to cold fury. They would be coming through that door any second. She snatched a heavy 12-inch cast-iron skillet from a hook. She tested its weight, its balance. It felt more natural in her hand than the pen and order pad ever had. "Thorne Automata," she said, her back to Croft as she watched the door. "He said his father was Daniel Thorne." "He was the founder," Croft panted, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. "The old guard. He refused to modernize, to streamline. He ran the company into the ground with sentimentality. And you acquired it," Elena stated. It wasn't a question. It was a sound business decision. "We salvaged the valuable IP. The rest was unavoidable collateral damage." "What happened to Daniel Thorne?" she asked, her voice flat. Croft's jaw tightened. He couldn't handle the failure. The company was his life. He drove his car off the Mystic River Bridge a month after the final papers were signed. It was a tragedy. "It wasn't a tragedy," Elena said, her eyes narrowing as she saw a shadow fall across the small window. "It was a motive. This isn't about money. This is a checkmate. Personal." A thunderous bang on the door confirmed her assessment. They were trying to force it. Elena grabbed a large wheeled rack of baking sheets and positioned it next to the door. She looked at Croft, her eyes chips of flint. The timid waitress was gone, exercised by the adrenaline and the familiar thrill of the game. In her place was a strategist, cold and absolute. "Listen to me, Mr. Croft. Julian, your entire life you have been the one giving orders. For the next 10 minutes that changes. You are a piece on this board, and I am the one moving you. If you hesitate, if you question me, you will get us both killed. Do you understand?" Julian Croft, a man who commanded legions of employees and moved markets with a single phone call, found himself staring into the eyes of his only hope. He gave a single numb nod. "I understand." The kitchen door burst inward. One of Thorne's men, one of the bishops, stepped through, gun first, sweeping the room. He expected to see cowering kitchen staff. He didn't expect the rolling rack of sheet pans that Elena kicked with all her might. It careened into him, a cacophony of crashing metal. He stumbled back, disoriented, his aim thrown off for a critical second. Elena exploded from behind the counter. She didn't go for his gun hand. She threw the heavy cast-iron skillet like a discus. It spun through the air and struck the man square in the chest. The blow, amplified by the man's own body armor, didn't break bone, but it stole his breath and sent a shocking, concussive force through his entire body. He staggered backward, gasping for air. Before he could recover, Elena was on him. She grabbed a fistful of salt from an open basin on the prep counter and flung it directly into his eyes. He roared in pain, instinctively dropping his weapon to claw at his face. As he doubled over, blinded and choking, Elena drove her knee up into his chin. His head snapped back with a sickening crack, and he crumpled to the greasy floor. 2 pieces down. From the dining room, Thorne's voice bellowed, filled with rage. "He's in the kitchen! Forget stealth! Get him!" Elena knew they had seconds. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes calculating angles and possibilities. The service elevator? Too slow. The back door? It led to a locked, gated alley. Then she saw it, an old, forgotten feature of the building. A dumbwaiter, used decades ago to send food to a private dining room 1 floor below. It was a small, cramped metal box, probably not used in years. "There," she said, pointing. "It's our only move." "You're insane," Croft yelled. "We'll be trapped in a box." "It's better than being trapped in a tomb," she retorted, pulling on the thick rope that operated the manual pulley system. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, dusty shaft. "Get in. Head first." As Thorne and his last man burst into the kitchen, they saw a sight that defied all logic. The billionaire tech mogul, Julian Croft, was scrambling feet first into a tiny dumbwaiter shaft, being pushed by a waitress. Thorne raised his pistol and fired. The bullet sparked off the dumbwaiter's metal door, just as Elena slammed it shut, plunging her and Croft into suffocating darkness. They were in a 4 by 4 foot cage, dangling by a rope in a black shaft, with only one direction to go: down. The rope groaned in protest as Elena began to lower them, hand over hand, into the unknown belly of the building. The hunt had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. The dumbwaiter shaft was a vertical coffin, thick with the smell of dust and decay. The metal box groaned under their combined weight as Elena controlled their descent with a thick, greasy rope, the friction burning her palms. Above them, they could hear furious shouting and the sound of heavy blows against the metal door. Thorne was trying to break through. "Where does this go?" Croft whispered, his voice tight with claustrophobia. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on them. "The floor below houses the wine cellar and the dry storage rooms." Elena replied, her voice strained with effort. "It's a maze down there. They won't know the layout." "I do." The box jolted to a stop. They were at the bottom. Elena fumbled in the dark for the latch on the interior door and pushed. It opened into a narrow corridor, lit by a single bare emergency bulb that cast long, distorted shadows. They were in the service level of the building, a subterranean world of concrete floors and exposed pipes. It was cold, damp, and blessedly quiet. Croft stumbled out of the dumbwaiter, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. He looked at his hands, then at Elena. Her palms were raw and bleeding from handling the rope. She seemed not to notice, her attention already focused on their new surroundings. "You've been planning this," he said, a note of awe in his voice. "Not just reacting. You had this escape route mapped out." "I see the whole board, Mr. Croft," she said, tearing a strip of fabric from the hem of her apron and wrapping it tightly around her more injured hand. "It's what I do. Now we need to find another way out. The service corridors should lead to the main loading dock." "Thorne won't just give up," Croft argued. "He'll have his last man cover the ground floor exits. He'll come down here himself. We're still trapped." "Then we stop playing defense," Elena said, her eyes glinting in the dim light. She began walking down the corridor, her movements confident and purposeful. "We set a trap. We make him come to us." She led him past stacks of cleaning supplies and boxes of linens, turning into a cavernous, climate-controlled room. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of old wood and fermenting grapes. It was the wine cellar. Racks of wine bottles, thousands of them, stretched from floor to ceiling, creating a labyrinth of narrow aisles. "In chess, this is called a Zwischenzug," she explained softly, her voice echoing in the vast, silent room. "An in-between move. He expects us to run for an exit. He doesn't expect us to turn the board around and attack his king." She scanned the room, her mind absorbing the details. The heavy oak racks, the single, steel-reinforced door they had entered through. The ventilation system humming quietly overhead, a small maintenance closet in the far corner. "He will come through that door," she said, pointing back the way they came. "His last man will be waiting by the loading dock. He has us in a pincer move, a classic fork, but he thinks he's the only one playing." She turned to Croft, her expression deadly serious. "I need you to trust me, implicitly. I am going to ask you to do something that will feel like the most counterintuitive thing in the world." Before Croft could respond, the heavy steel door to the corridor creaked open. A beam of light from a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the racks of priceless vintages. "It's over, Croft," Marcus Thorne's voice boomed, amplified by the cellar's acoustics. "You can't run forever. This entire level is on lockdown. My man has the only way out. Come out now, and I'll make this quick." Elena pulled Croft behind a massive rack of Bordeaux, shielding them from the light. She picked up 2 heavy dark green bottles of Cabernet Sauvignon. She handed one to Croft. "When I tell you," she whispered, her breath misting in the cold air, "I want you to throw this as hard as you can at that light. Don't try to be a hero. Just create a sound, a diversion, then run to the maintenance closet in the far corner and lock yourself inside." "And you," Croft whispered back, his knuckles white as he gripped the bottle. "I'm going to end the game," she replied. The flashlight beam moved closer, methodically sweeping the aisles. Thorne was moving cautiously, professionally. He wasn't rushing in. "I know what you did to my father, you parasite," Thorne shouted, his voice laced with pain. You bled his company dry, sold it for parts, and called it progress. He put a gun in his mouth because of you, but he was too proud to even leave a note. He just erased himself. The raw emotion in his voice gave Elena the edge she needed. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a grieving son. His anger was his strength, but it was also his weakness. It clouded his judgment. The beam of light passed over their aisle and moved to the next one. Elena knew he would circle back. "Get ready," she mouthed to Croft. The light began to sweep back toward them. "Now," she hissed. Croft, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a desperate desire to survive, hurled the wine bottle. The bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux arced through the frigid air, a dark comet of liquid history, before shattering against the far concrete wall. The sound was not merely a crash, it was a detonation of glass and time, a violent, wet explosion that sprayed the scent of dark fruit, old oak, and terror across the cellar. As predicted, as calculated, Marcus Thorne pivoted, his combat instincts overriding his strategic mind. His entire being, his weapon, his tactical flashlight, his rage, locked onto the source of the sound. It was the feint, the sacrifice of a minor piece to draw the king into a fatal position. He had taken the bait. Elena did not run. Flight was a novice's panic. She flowed. A shadow detaching from other shadows, she moved through the canyons of sleeping wine. Her own bottle held not as a club, but as a weighted extension of her will. Thorne, advancing down aisle 7, was a hunter certain of his quarry. Elena, flanking him in aisle 8, was the board itself, reconfiguring around a player who didn't know the rules had changed. The universe had contracted to this cold, dark space, to the sound of his boots on the gritty floor and the frantic, silent drumbeat of her own heart. She heard Croft's desperate sprint, the scramble for the maintenance closet, and then the final, definitive clank of the bolt sliding home. Thorne heard it too. He froze. The geometry of the trap resolved in his mind, and he understood his mistake. The thrown bottle was misdirection. The billionaire was the prize. A low, cruel smile played on his lips. He had his man cornered. He turned, presenting his back to the aisle where Elena stood poised, his focus absolute, his victory seemingly assured. "It's over, Julian," he murmured, the words a venomous caress in the echoing silence. "The game ends here." He was wrong. The game had ended the moment he mistook his opponent. This was the Zwischenzug, the in-between move that changes the value of every piece on the board. He believed he was executing a final attack, but in turning toward the closet, he had voluntarily walked into her check lane. She emerged from the aisle's end, a wraith of vengeance he never saw coming. Perhaps a flicker of displaced air, or the faintest whisper of her rubber-soled shoe alerted him. He began to turn, his body coiled with lethal grace. He was fast, a product of expensive training and singular purpose. But she was not operating on the plane of speed. She was operating on the plane of inevitability. She did not aim for his head. Armor and instinct would protect it. She targeted the foundation. The heavy punt of the bottle, a weapon forged in the vineyards of Bordeaux, swung in a low, vicious arc. It connected with the back of his right knee with a sound that was both sickeningly wet and brutally sharp, a composite of tearing ligament, shattering patella, and splintering bone. His scream was not one of rage, but of pure, animal agony. It was the sound of a system collapsing, of a body betraying its master. His leg buckled, folding at an impossible angle. He crashed to the concrete, his weapon clattering away, his flashlight spinning wildly, its beams strafing the ceiling in a frantic, silent disco of light and shadow. The cellar became a strobe-lit nightmare, freezing moments in time. Thorne's face contorted in a mask of agony, the dark stain of spilled wine spreading like blood. The glint of the discarded pistol just beyond his reach. Elena was on him before his scream had fully died. The jagged, broken neck of a bottle she'd quietly snapped against a rack, now pressed against the pulse of his carotid artery. The sharp edges bit into his skin, a promise of finality. He gasped, his breath hitching, the pain in his leg a white-hot supernova, eclipsed only by the cold, sharp reality at his throat. He stared up, his eyes wide with disbelief, trying to reconcile the image of the phantom waitress with the predator who now held his life in her hands. "Checkmate," she whispered, her voice a shard of ice in the cold air. It wasn't a taunt, it was a statement of fact, a diagnosis. She then proceeded to dismantle him, not his body, but his entire reason for being there. "Your strategy was flawed from the opening," she said, her voice low and clinical, each word a precisely placed piece on the board. "You chose a public venue, a fortress, believing the height and security were obstacles that, once overcome, would guarantee your success. A classic overreach. You saw them as a challenge, not as a layered defense that would trap you inside with your target." Thorne gritted his teeth, sweat and tears of pain carving paths through the grime on his face. "Your personnel," she continued, her grip unwavering. 4 men. A solid number, but you deployed them inefficiently. You placed 2 rooks to control the elevator exit, a single path of retreat. You used a knight to neutralize 1 guard. You, the king, advanced unprotected. You assumed the rest of the room. The 60 other people were inert. Scenery. You didn't account for a single pawn promoting. The jagged glass pressed a fraction deeper. A line of crimson welled on his skin. "But your greatest failure," she said, her eyes boring into his, "was your motive, revenge. You think it makes you strong, focused. It doesn't. It makes you predictable. Your father, Daniel Thorne, you moved against Croft on the anniversary of his death, a sentimental, foolish play. You chose this location because Croft celebrated his first major acquisition here 10 years ago. Another sentimental tell. Your entire plan wasn't a strategy, it was a memorial, a temper tantrum with guns. You weren't here to win, you were here to make a point, and players who prioritize making a point over winning always lose." He stared at her, the physical pain dissolving into a deeper, more profound agony. She hadn't just beaten him, she had understood him. She had mapped his grief, weaponized his love, and used the very structure of his pain to destroy him. He was no longer a vengeful son. He was a specimen under her microscope, his every move anticipated, his every thought laid bare. He began to sob, a broken, wretched sound that had nothing to do with his ruined knee. The strobe from the flashlight finally sputtered and died, plunging the cellar into near-total darkness, leaving only the thin, cold light from the corridor. The scene was a pietà of violence, the Avenger broken on the floor, weeping for a loss far greater than the knight's, and the pawn who had become a queen, standing over him, the silent, final arbiter of his fate. The aftermath unfolded not in a storm of noise, but in a creeping, sterile silence. The first sign was the distant muffled sound of SWAT team commands filtering down through the building's concrete bones. Then the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness from the corridor, followed by the heavy tread of boots. Julian Croft, his face pale and drawn, emerged from the maintenance closet, flanked by 2 heavily armed officers. He stopped, his gaze falling upon the scene. He saw Thorne, curled on the floor, a desolate heap of broken ambition. He saw the discarded pistol, the shattered glass, the dark pools of wine, and he saw Elena. She was standing a few feet away from Thorne now, the broken bottle held loosely at her side, her shoulders slumped. The ferocious energy, the preternatural focus, was gone. In its place was a profound and terrible weariness. The adrenaline had abandoned her, leaving behind the bill. Her hands began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The raw, bleeding skin on her palms, which she had ignored for an hour, now screamed with pain. The queen had retreated, and the waitress, a young woman who just wanted to pay her rent, was left to deal with the carnage. Croft took a half-step toward her, his mouth open to say something, what he didn't know. "Thank you? How? Who are you?" But Detective Mulligan, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the city's exhaustion, put a gentle hand on his arm. "Let's give her a minute, sir." They led Thorne away on a stretcher, his one good hand covering his face. They took Croft upstairs to give a statement. Paramedics came for Elena, but she waved them away, needing the silence more than antiseptic. She sat on an overturned crate of what looked like cleaning supplies, her head in her hands, the trembling slowly subsiding into a deep internal cold. Her father's voice echoed in the cavern of her memory. Not the coach, the grandmaster, but the paranoid, broken man who saw threats in every shadow. "They will always underestimate you, Alonia," he would say, using her childhood name, his breath thick with cheap vodka. "The world is not a kind place. It is a board of knives. You must see the attack before it is made. You must be the butcher, not the lamb." She had spent a decade trying to exercise that voice, to unlearn his brutal lessons. She had chosen a life of invisibility, of simple, linear tasks. Take the order, deliver the food, clear the table. A life where the most complex calculation was splitting a check 4 ways. She had convinced herself she had escaped him, escaped the crushing weight of his genius and his fear. But tonight, in the crucible of violence, his lessons had not only saved her, they had possessed her. She had moved with his cold logic, struck with his unforgiving precision. She had become the butcher, and the realization left her feeling hollowed out, as if she had won the game only to lose herself. When Julian Croft found her an hour later, the first hint of a bruised gray dawn was seeping into the loading bay. The air was cold and sharp with the smell of diesel and rain-washed asphalt. She was sitting on the rear bumper of an ambulance, a paramedic having finally convinced her to let him bandage her hands. The pristine white gauze was a stark contrast to her dirt-smeared, blood-flecked uniform. Croft stood before her, stripped of his usual armor of arrogance. His billion-dollar suit was a wreck. His face was smudged with dust, but the change was deeper. His eyes, usually instruments of appraisal and dismissal, were filled with a raw, unnerving wonder. He looked like a man who had just seen the laws of physics bend. "They told me what you said to him," Croft began, his voice raspy. "The detectives, they have him in interrogation. He's not talking about his plan. He's talking about you. He keeps repeating what you said, how you took apart his strategy, his motive." Elena stared at her bandaged hands. They felt like foreign objects, tools belonging to someone else. "I've spent my life surrounded by the smartest people money can buy," Croft continued, taking a hesitant step closer. "Quants from MIT, lawyers from Harvard, strategists from the Pentagon. They analyze threats. They build models. They mitigate risk. But what you did tonight, that wasn't analysis. That was something else. It was instinctive. You didn't just see his moves. You saw his soul." He paused, searching for the right words. "When you stood over him in that cellar, I didn't see a bodyguard. I didn't see a soldier. I saw an artist. And the medium you work in is cause and effect, action and consequence. It's the purest, most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed." "My father taught me chess," she said, the words tasting like ash. It felt insufficient, a child's explanation for an act of God. "That's what Mulligan said you had in your locker," Croft nodded. "A chess set. He called it a game. He's wrong. It's not a game. It's a language, and you're a native speaker. The rest of us are just learning the alphabet." He looked away toward the emerging skyline of the city he had considered his kingdom. "For 20 years, I've operated on a simple principle: overwhelming force. Buy the competitor, crush the obstacle, liquidate the asset. It's a crude, effective strategy, the strategy of a bulldozer, but it has a weakness. It leaves a trail of wreckage. It creates ghosts. Tonight, one of those ghosts came back to kill me." He met her eyes again. "You didn't save my life with force, Elena. You saved it with elegance. You used his own momentum, his own pain to defeat him. You weren't a bulldozer. You were a scalpel." This was the moment of the offer. She could feel it coming. A job, head of security, a blank check, a life of violence she had just narrowly survived. She braced herself to refuse. "I am not going to offer you a job as my head of security," Croft said, as if reading her mind. "It would be an insult. It would be like asking a physicist to be a bricklayer because he understands gravity." He reached into his jacket, but instead of a wallet, he pulled out a simple, ink-stained napkin from the restaurant. He borrowed a pen from a nearby officer. He didn't write a number. He drew a diagram, a network of circles and lines. "This is my world," he said, pointing to the central circle. Nexus Dynamics, and these are my opponents. Rival corporations, rogue hedge funds, state-sponsored industrial espionage units. They don't use guns and tasers. They use algorithms, misinformation, hostile share acquisitions, and social engineering. It's a global board, and the game never ends. I've been playing it with a bulldozer. He looked at her, his expression one of dawning, desperate clarity. I don't need a new driver for the bulldozer, Elena. I need an entirely new way to play. I need someone who sees the whole board, not just the pieces, but the invisible lines of force connecting them. The emotional vulnerabilities, the sentimental tells. He held out the napkin. It wasn't a contract. It was a question. I'm not offering you a job. I'm asking for a partnership. I want you to be my analyst, my strategist, my Zwischenzug. Work from anywhere. Name your own terms. I give you the problem. You show me the board. You show me the move no one else can see. The offer hung in the air, terrifying and seductive. It was an invitation back into the world she had fled, the world of relentless calculation and psychological warfare. But it was different. Her father's game was a desperate, paranoid fight for survival in a world of knives. This was a game of creation and defense, on a scale she could barely comprehend. It was a chance to use the gift that had always felt like a curse, not as a weapon of grim necessity, but as an instrument of sublime intellectual power. She looked from the napkin to his face, and she made her first move. "The staff," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Everyone who was in that restaurant tonight, from the chef to the dishwashers. They're collateral damage in your war. Their workplace is a crime scene. You will pay their full salaries with hazard bonuses until it reopens. You will also provide trauma counseling for every one of them for as long as they need it." Croft didn't blink. "Agreed." "Thorn Automata," she pressed on, her voice harder now. "You didn't just liquidate a company. You erased a community. The pension fund you gutted supported hundreds of families. The ghost that came for you tonight was born from that. It was a strategic vulnerability. You will make that pension fund whole, and you will endow a new one, in Daniel Thorne's name, for its former employees." This time, Croft was silent for a long moment. He looked at the drawing on the napkin, then back at her. He wasn't seeing a list of demands. He was seeing her first strategic analysis. She wasn't negotiating a contract. She was closing the vulnerabilities in his own defense. She was shoring up his back rank. It was the most brilliant move he had ever seen. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a king who has just discovered the true power of his queen. "Consider it done, Miss Petrova." Elena took the napkin. It felt heavier than any check could. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed into a quiet apartment overlooking the Boston Public Garden. The space was minimalist, furnished with comfortable chairs, shelves of books, and in the center of the room, a single beautiful Staunton chessboard. The pieces were made of rosewood and boxwood, weighted and felted, a gift from a man who was beginning to understand the value of the right tools. Elena sat not at the board, but in an armchair nearby, a tablet in her lap. On the screen was not a game, but a complex web of encrypted communications, stock market fluctuations, and satellite imagery of shipping lanes in the South China Sea. It was the data stream of a hostile takeover attempt on one of Croft's key subsidiaries by a shadowy overseas consortium. To anyone else, it was noise. To her, it was a symphony. She saw the feints, the gambits, the subtle pressure being applied to a weak flank. Her phone buzzed. It was Croft. "They're moving on the logistics division," he said, his voice tense, lacking its usual confidence. "They're trying to force a sell-off before the quarterly report. It's a classic blitz attack. My team says we need to divest, cut our losses." Elena's eyes drifted to the chessboard. She pictured the problem. The consortium was a pair of aggressive rooks, controlling the open files. Croft's team saw only a defensive retreat. They didn't see the quiet pawn, a small, overlooked patent for drone delivery software that could be advanced. "Don't divest, Julian," she said calmly. "Leak the Phase 3 trial data from the drone patent to that tech blogger in Singapore, the one they've been trying to recruit. It's an unprotected piece they think is theirs. When they see the data, they'll think you're panicking, trying to inflate your value. They'll short the stock to accelerate your collapse. They'll crush us, Croft protested. No, Elena said, her voice serene, because the patent isn't the real weapon. The leak is. It will force their hand, make them overcommit their capital to the short. While they do that, we execute a quiet buyback through our shell corporation in Luxembourg. We sacrifice the pawn to trap their rooks. By the time they realize the stock isn't collapsing, we'll own another 15% of our own company, paid for with their money. It's not a retreat. It's a discovered check. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Elena could almost hear the gears turning in Croft's mind, the old bulldozer instincts warring with this new, elegant, and lethal logic. My God, he finally whispered. After the call, Elena walked over to the chessboard. The morning light caught the polished sheen of the rosewood queen. She picked it up. Its weight felt familiar, comfortable. It was no longer a burden. Her father had taught her that the goal of the game was to destroy the other king, a grim, zero-sum battle for survival. He was wrong. The true goal, the beautiful, complex, and infinitely challenging goal, was to create an order so perfect, so unassailable, that the battle was won before it ever began. She placed the queen back on the board, not in the center, but on a quiet square at the edge, where it watched over everything, patient and powerful. The game was a part of her, but it no longer owned her. She was no longer the butcher or the lamb. She was simply the player, and for the first time in her life, she felt free,